Hello. So today I'm with Connor Alexander, the CEO of Coyote and Crow, which is a game company that makes all sorts of things, including the Coyote and Crow board game, but currently has a Kickstarter for a board game called Wolves. So I'm probably doing a poor job of introduction, so I'll let you sort of introduce yourself here as well.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Connor Alexander, citizen of the Cherokee Nation, an American citizen. I'm also Mexican and Scottish. I started a Kickstarter. I jumped to Kickstarter back in 2021 for a role-playing game called Coyote and Crow. It was sort of an unexpected success. The basis for that was an alternate history where America was never colonized. And it takes place in a near future science fantasy setting where folks get to play folks indigenous to North and South America in a really cool, fun, positive role-playing setting. The game took off way more than I expected. I was originally expecting to just put out the book, be done with it, maybe connect with a few hundred fans and be done. Although my background is working in the game industry, I'd never published a game before. So when it took off, I really kind of reevaluated things and decided to open a publishing company, a game publishing company that was focused on not only presenting games that had more positive and accurate native representation in it, but also put more games out there with some native themes in it and try to give native creatives in the industry side a way into making a little more money and getting a little more face time in the hobby industry, because there's not a whole lot of us working in the hobby industry. So that's kind of where I'm at now, and now we're on to our second full Kickstarter for Wolves. So,
and if I recall, that funded in 5 hours.
Yeah, just under about 4 hours, 45 minutes, something like that. Yeah. Not too bad.
Yeah, that's not bad at all. I was going to say there's a lot of people who don't ever sort of successfully pull off a Kickstarter, and that's 2 for 2. I see that you are at when I'm looking at it, it's in Canadian dollars, so it's at 90,000 of the $32,000 or $33,000 goal. So
we're expecting to hit our first stretch goal here in, I don't know, any time now. We're just a few backers shy really of our first stretch goal, which is a free tabletop simulator version of the game. We basically already had sort of the skeleton of one constructed that we were using for testing, which is it's a platform on Steam if you're not familiar, and it's a great way to sort of play test games remotely. But you can also use it for public consumption, and we decided as our first stretch goal that we'd pretty it up and make it look as good as the physical version of the game, and put it out to the public. So let them play hopefully before they even back. So if they're the kind of backer on Kickstarter that likes to try before they buy, this is a great way to do that.
That sounds excellent. And I got to say, it's a very, looking at your sort of prototype pieces, it's a very pretty game, which is it's visually appealing, which is good because a lot of games aren't necessarily. And I see that you also made a commitment to, there's no plastic pieces there. It's all wood and paper and sort of biodegradable or recyclable materials, which is also cool.
Yeah, we've always had sort of the environment in mind as a sort of a company ethos, but I didn't really have there wasn't really a whole lot to do with that for Coyote and Crow, the RPG, outside of printing here in the US. We did our best to make it as environmentally friendly as possible, but it's a book, right? But when it came to making a board game, it was really inspired by the game Daybreak, which funded on BackerKit. Oh, thank you. Yes. Daybreak, which is a game by CMYK, had these goals for not only doing FSC certified games, but having them completely plastic free. And I was really inspired by that. So I talked to my manufacturer, and it turns out it was a lot easier than I thought. Specifically with this game, there really wasn't a whole lot that we had to steer around. The only thing that was strange was shrink wrap. Like, shrink wrap is the default for everything. I didn't even want shrink wrap, so I had to work on that one a little bit.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of what the substitute for shrink wrap is.
So it turns out it's actually really simple, and a couple of companies have done this before. I can't think of one off the top of my head at the moment, but I know there are a couple of that have already done this. These little tiny tabs that go on each side of the box that hold the lid down in place. They look like they'd be made of plastic, but they're actually a biodegradable material, a corn-based material. And the only downside is that you have to be really careful when you peel them off the box, otherwise they can tear the paper. There isn't quite the same level of control that you get with some of the plastic adhesives. So
just kind of sticking it down rather than, because
yeah,
you don't want it opening up in transit and
exactly. Or sitting on the shelf and having people pawing through the boxes and components go missing and all that kind of good stuff. So yeah.
Well, and the other thing is, I think wood tokens and so forth are they're gonna feel better than plastic tokens. They're gonna,
absolutely. There's certainly, for me at least, there's a textual nature to board games. And while I do play some stuff digitally, and there are some things on Board Game Arena or Tabletop Simulator or digital ports of board games that I will play, I'm a big fan of handling games and feeling those pieces. I love that.
Oh, and there's a lot of games where I've gone and replaced pieces just because that tactile element to it.
Yeah.
A game that I've played a bunch. It came with tiny little paper tokens for sort of the currency in the game, and it's a lot more fun playing it with like clay poker chips, because when you're moving around the currency and so forth, it feels real. So that is that's kind of sort of a useful thing there. So
if a game that I love offers as some sort of like side thing, an upgrade for like metal coins, I'm a sucker for that stuff. I can't say no to that.
Oh, and I've gone to like the pet store for little fish tokens, the little glass tokens to replace things, because those it just feels better. So I liked, when I saw that, I was like, it's great for the environment, but it's also just nice from a player perspective. So
yeah.
Now, one thing I really liked. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was just saying I really liked seeing both the semi-cooperative aspect and the theme on this one, because I mean, I am 0% Indigenous, but I sort of have some connections to some Indigenous communities. And when I sort of heard the theme, I was like, that really sort of resonates. It's a really cool theme to it. So I guess, can you tell us a bit about the game? And
so it started as a negative reaction to sort of a meme that was based on an old story, which is the story of Inside You There Are Two Wolves. Are you familiar with this parable?
Yes.
So it gets attributed to the Cherokee people quite a bit, and it's not a Cherokee story. It doesn't espouse Cherokee values, and it gets repeated even within Indigenous communities, and that's sort of the sort of insidious nature of these kind of stories, is that they circle around enough times, and people will absorb them and think that it's accurately an Indigenous story. Everything I've read, it actually goes back to a televangelist. I'm not even going to say his name, but anyway, that story always bugged me. And the original name for this game was originally a pun. Was they're actually going to actually call it Inside You There Are Two Wolves, just as a way to get people's attention. But I realized that at that point it was going to sort of reinforce the negativity of that story, the negative sort of view of that story that I have, and I was sort of undermining my own point. So I just ended up stripping it back to wolves. And the idea was that I wanted to tell a story within games, within the tabletop space, about the idea of people working together and still having a victor at the end, but not trying to punish other players. You're not, in this game, you are not out to crush everyone else. This is not the Monopoly paradigm of board games. I wanted to create a game where everybody was encouraged to assist each other throughout the game, and everybody crosses the finish line. But once you cross that finish line, there's still an individual winner. So, the objective for this game is to every community, every player is playing the leader of a community. Every community needs resources every turn to survive. You're trying to survive through a winter. And at the end of that winter, if everybody has made it across the finish line, then whoever has gained the most status over the course of the game is elected leader. But if anybody fails over the course of the game, if any community fails to have their basic needs met, everyone loses the game. And I don't see that kind of setup very often in most board games. There's not a whole lot of games that have that kind of mechanic. And I feel like it's one that I don't know. I'm not going to say it's original entirely. I don't think there's anything new under the sun when it comes to board games. I think everybody's come up with at least a variation on pretty much every mechanic out there these days. But I do like to think that it's at least a good nod toward a lot of indigenous values. There's a word in Cherokee that we use a lot, gadugi. Gadugi is sort of stronger or strength through community. And we use it a lot as a way to sort of lift each other up. And I really like that as a game ethos, as a sort of a bedrock for a game concept. So that was kind of the inspiration on the start for Wolves.
When I saw that, the first thing that came to mind was some of the gifting cultures that in terms of like gaining status by giving things away to others. I sort of went, okay, that seems to play into that, but the whole thing of like nobody wins if anybody loses is I feel like I may have seen it before, but it's not a common mechanic by any stretch, because usually games just either they're about crushing your opponents, as you mentioned, or you're allowed to sort of fall so far behind that you're just out of the game. Whereas this means that everyone else has an incentive to make sure you're not too far behind. Like
And not to make it sound like it's all rainbows and unicorns. There's certainly a game there where, especially during the gifting phase, where you have to be cognizant of what you're gifting and why, and what gifts you're accepting. It's tempting to just accept gifts willy-nilly and sort of hoard resources, as it were. But every time you're accepting gift, that other person is getting status. And do you want to give them that status? Because at the end of the game, you also want to be elected leader. So there is a give and take there. I do like competitive games. My favorite game of all time is Android Netrunner, which is an absolutely cutthroat.
I was going to say, that's short of like diplomacy. I think that's pretty much top of the competitive scale.
It is. And I love that competitiveness, and I'm certainly not trying to portray all Indigenous people as some sort of communistic love fest. There's if you look at any Indigenous sports or Indigenous board games, a lot of them are really competitive. I just don't see I just don't see a lot of conflict where there can't be competition, and where we have to have a situation where we're always crushing our opponents. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
That sort of competition by cooperation thing is an interesting mechanic. It shows up a bit in Bonanza, where you're trying to
in years,
but the whole aspect of like, okay, it's good to get things, but you also have to think like, what is that doing for them? Is there a benefit to it? And Bonanza is a game where you can watch people who play really cutthroat just absolutely get trashed, because if they don't realize that they have to give things away, they end up sort of at the bottom tier of things going, what happened?
So I used to work at a game store, and it's actually how I sort of got involved in the game industry. And this was back in 2014. And my boss loved Bonanza. And I tell you, I am horrible at it. And I've played it maybe 10 times, and I was crushed every single time. Not even close.
It's a tough one, but you have to balance that sort of competitive instinct. So I really like that kind of I feel like that adds more to a game than just purely crush your opponent, because it's another thing to consider, right?
Absolutely. There's certainly games out there that I love where it is all just, get points when everyone else loses. There's a lot of games that fall under that umbrella for me. But when I come across a game that has an unusual win condition and a game that makes me reconsider my strategy over the course of the game, as I can feel myself jockeying for position, those are games I really engage in. Yeah.
I mean, one of the most fun things I think is that first game where you sit down and you just absolutely lose, like you get just trounced because you realize only like 3/4 of the way in, I've been playing the game for the wrong goals. Like I have not, this game is more dynamic than what it needed or than what I thought. And you're just like, oh, okay. And then you have to reevaluate, reassess.
Did you ever play the Battlestar Galactica board game?
I think so. That was that's the one with the sort of trader mechanic and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. And I love trader mechanic games. None of the rest of my game group does. They all hate it, but I love it. And I always hope that I'm the Cylon. And man, I was terrible the first time I was the Cylon. I thought I would rule, and I gave myself away way too late in the game, and the humans crushed me.
That was my experience. Was I gave myself away at a point where it was just like, it doesn't matter what I do now. There literally is no option. Saboteur is great for the sabotage mechanic.
I've only played that one time, but I had a really good time with it.
That one is really great, and it's great for when you've got like a group of larger group, but especially it plays surprisingly well with like a mixed age group.
Oh,
because young kids can play Saboteur just as well as adults, and they can be vicious.
Okay, I can see that. Yeah. Okay.
I've seen like 8-year-olds just completely trounce people at Saboteur. It's just simple cards and so forth, but if you've got a kid who could play innocent, they will.
Oh yeah, that's dangerous for sure.
So one thing I also really kind of like is looking at sort of some of the ideas in your board game kind of made me think about just how much our background kind of plays into the themes for a board game and how we decide how to make a board game look and feel.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking like the thought that came to mind is Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico, it's a great game. It's fantastic. But you can see some of the...
It's a really cool game.
Oh, yeah, but you can see some of the assumptions, especially if you get the original printing where they didn't rename it from to colonist
better
tokens.
Now, but yeah.
Yeah. For the people who don't know, Puerto Rico, you have to... a lot of what you're doing involves little worker tokens they're little brown tokens, and the original printings said slaves, and later they changed that to colonists, but they never actually changed the tokens.
Yeah.
So they're still the same. But I mean, you could make that game, that same mechanical game, look like anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those
you
assumptions.
Can completely retheme that and have something much better. Yeah.
And so I think of, when I look at wolves, it's a very positive, uplifting theme, and I like that. It's
It goes back to my ethos for the cover of the Coyote and Crow role-playing game. I had a lot of conversations with my artists, especially my cover artists, and the conversations were always, even when I'm dealing with native artists, there's a mix of native artists and non-native artists in the Coyote and Crow role-playing game, and a lot of them have a hard time gripping or wrapping their head around the science fantasy end of the Indigenous equation. They were able to, or if they're native, they were able to capture the indigeneity part, right? But I think we're all just conditioned, I think, at this point by Western media to think of the past, a lot of drab colors. And if you know any natives, they are not like drab people. Like we love any excuse to wear color. Like we are brightly colored people. And I wanted to express that in my games by having a positive, upbeat cover. I mean, I think if you look at most role-playing games that have a science fantasy element to them. I'm just thinking stuff like Cyberpunk or Shadowrun. You get a lot of that sort of grim, dark atmosphere. And that kind of goes back to a lot of the tragedy porn that you see when it comes to Indigenous people. And so I said,
yeah,
let's
this is
use
a
bright
bright and
color.
shiny color or cover there. The
Yeah.
you know, and a very
Yeah,
different aesthetic from
our first
the
stretch goal was that UV gloss coating on the cover, because I was like, I want something that's shiny and bright and pops, looks optimistic. And I think that carried over with Wolves, where I said, I wanted something that was colorful and positive and engaging. I mean, yes, you're dealing with getting enough resources to survive the winter, but that doesn't mean we had to have, this horrible black and gray color scheme, right? So I tried to make it as bright and positive as possible, and tried to carry over a little bit of that futurism and modernity in the graphic design work as well. Hopefully that comes through.
I'm just trying to think of some of the other games. What was the zombie one that's set around
Dead
the
of Winter.
winter? Yeah, and it's really sort of dark themes and so
Yeah.
forth, which
Yeah, and it's perfect for that. I mean, I think that one works great for its color scheme, right? But I feel like we see a lot of that when it comes to indigeneity. We see a lot of down colors and darkness. I mean, I'm thinking right now the show that's currently on, I think it's on AMC, called Dark Winds. And when you look at that color, I mean, yes, it's set in the desert, but all the ads put it in sort of shadows and put it sort of dark colors. So I wanted to get away from that a little bit,
yeah, it seems like this is more like, often you see sort of depictions of sepia tone and a lot of like buckskin, which is, sort of the brownish color, as opposed to like, this makes me think more like ribbon skirt, which,
Yes.
that sort of
Yes,
display of color where
thank you.
it's
Absolutely. Thank you. That's
so
exactly what I was going for. Early on in the conversations with my artists, we talk about things like buckskins or moccasins, and I'm like, yeah, of course there's going to be buckskins and moccasins still. They're cool clothing that people would carry forward from these cultures, but that doesn't mean that they would always be sepia toned or beige. In this future we're creating, they've got access to all the dyes and coloring they would want. So why wouldn't they be more colorful? So I think getting people out of that mindset, even natives, getting them out of that mindset can be tough sometimes.
well, I mean, the that mindset ends up being quite pervasive. You get people who end up learning about their culture from another culture's negative views of it, which
Yeah,
is a real sort of head screw at the end of the
it
day.
is.
It's
It is.
but
And I think it goes back to the whole thing about the inside there are two wolves story thing too, in that it perpetuates itself as sort of a negative cycle, or it can anyway. But like if you go to any powwow right now, I guarantee you're going to see a lot of color. Of course, you're going to see buckskins and moccasins, but there's going to be a lot of color there.
oh, absolutely. All of the ceremonial regalia is just bright colors. It's showing off and
yeah.
and like amazing beadwork and that kind of thing. Now I'm just every time I look at a board game, I'm always doing that mental thing of how could you upgrade like components, and how could and now I'm going like, okay, you could get some beads, replace some of that. I just always do that in my head. And this is a trade-off that every board game designer has to come to, is that you've got your perfect components, and then you've got the ones that will hit a price point people will pay.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of which, it's really tough right now, I think, especially with potential for the UPS strike coming up. It's really difficult to frame your game and set up your game in a way that you want to set it up, but then also go back to your manufacturer and go, look, these are reasonable dimensions that I need. These are the costs I'm going to be incurring with shipping, and this is the price point that I can set it at. I mean, and that's coming around a little bit on board games. I think people are now understanding a little more that a game that used to be $40 is maybe now going to be $50. But it's not like anybody in the board game industry is getting rich outside of the Hasbros of the world. I mean, nobody is rolling in dough.
Yeah, I remember somebody said, like, if you are a really successful board game designer, it's probably still your second job,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
which is kind of, they're like, hey, look at all of these people who are really sort of successful board game designers. They design
Yeah.
like top 10 games, and what do they do for a living? They're like engineer or
Yeah.
mechanic or
Absolutely.
whatever else.
I'm
It's a
I'm a
tough
I'm a niche within a niche that I'm able to do this full time, and I'm literally a company of one. I have 0 employees, but I'm lucky that I get to work on a contractual basis with some great artists and great designers and writers. But yeah, I mean, when when I had a full time job working for a distributor, a board game distributor before Coyote and Crow, and when the Kickstarter took off about 2 weeks into that Kickstarter, I had to have a conversation with my boss. And so I said, if things keep going like this, I might have to take a leave of absence. And then a week later, I was turning in my notice. So I had to say, I can't do this full time and fulfill my Kickstarter. It's just gotten too big. There's too many responsibilities here. And so I took the plunge. But man, I am in a privileged few that can make a living doing this.
Well, and not just make a living. One thing I was noting on your webpage, you've got your sort of positions open thing, and
Yeah.
you note that you pay sort of above market or market prices and so
Hmm.
forth for those things, which
Yeah.
I see a lot of like people venturing into the Kickstarter field, and they leave behind them a trail of upset artists who didn't get paid,
Mm,
and or
yeah.
people who worked for like minimal amounts. So I really appreciated that whole aspect of like, like we pay competitive rates and strive to pay better than average. It's like, good on
Yeah.
you. That
Yeah.
and
Yeah, whenever I can. And I think, there's a flip side to that too, which is that I'm sort of handicapping myself because I try, especially when it comes to writing positions, there's no negotiation. I only hire native writers. I don't want anybody writing for Coyote and Crow that is not Indigenous. But when it comes to art, I always try to give preferential treatment to Indigenous artists, partially because they're going to bring their own voice to that piece of art, and sometimes that can be informative for me, and I can learn something new along the way, and the art gets better because they're Indigenous. But the flip side to that good pay thing is that I think I'm not trying to bash any one person in particular here. This is not at anybody specifically here, but I would say 90% of the folks I've worked with contractually have missed their due dates. And some of that is COVID related. Some of it is just life is harsh lately. But it's also a situation where I think folks in the board game industry and in the role playing game industry are amateur. And
yeah,
I'm not using the word amateur as an insult here. They're just not. They've not done this on a professional level. And I think sometimes their enthusiasm outweighs their capabilities. So when I'll say, hey, when can you get this piece in? And they say 2 weeks, what they really should have told me was 6 weeks. The problem is that, of course, then I've planned on 2 weeks. And so
right.
everybody gets backlogged. And that's, I think a perfect example of that was Stories of the Freelance, the first set of 10 adventures that we had for Coyote and Crow that crowdfunded on BackerKit. That was supposed to be a 4-month project and turned out to be an 18-month project.
Yeah, if you tell your printer, hey, we'll have something for you in 3 weeks because you think you've got your art in 2,
Yeah,
and then you're telling your printer, hey, I don't have it, and the printer's saying, I booked you like a block of time here.
yeah, exactly,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah, no, and
Yeah,
I know that ends up killing a lot of small projects because, um,
absolutely.
your printer might say, sorry, you put down a deposit, you don't get that back,
Yeah,
and then you're sitting there going, I don't have the money anymore.
yeah.
Um,
We'll let you know when we can get you back in the queue, and that is not a good conversation to have. So
no, I mean, there's not that many people who print like board game tokens and that kind of thing. So
yeah, yeah,
if you're backlogged, you're stuck. Um,
absolutely.
what was the pro like? This has got to be. I'm just sitting over there. It's kind of buried under some stuff here.
Mm.
I've got a board game prototype of my own that I need to get to play testing. So I'm kind of curious about your playtesting process and how you went from an idea. Actually, I guess I'll back that up a little bit. When you were thinking of this game, was the idea first like what you wanted the game to feel like, or more a mechanical idea?
Yeah, I am as much as I am stickler for. I mean, when you look at a game like Android Netrunner that is full of rules and a very specific framework, as much as I am a fan of that, for me, a game is always about what feeling do I walk away from, what feeling do I take away with it from it. And so for me, Inside You There Are Two Wolves, when I first conceived of that concept, I really wanted it to be about balancing the feeling of balancing my needs with balancing what the group needs. And it started out as purely a card game, and then it actually evolved into a bag builder. I don't know if you've played anything like, have you played Quacks of Quellenberg?
I haven't. It's on my list of things I've got to play because everybody says it's great.
So that game is a light bulb moment for me because that game is a game where you've got a bag and you're putting ingredients for potions into a bag over the course of the game. Your bag's getting more and more tokens in it, and it's sort of a push your luck game. You're pulling tokens out of the bag, and you want specific tokens. You don't want other tokens that are in there. And there's always that feeling of like, should I draw one more? And for a while, Wolves was about a bag building game, drawing those same resource concepts from a bag rather than from a deck of cards. But the scale ended up working out to where you ended up with, by the end of the game, you ended up with a lot of tokens in the bag and way too much time drawing. It was drawing onto like a 2-hour game for 5 people, and the game was going on too long. And so that sort of, at that point, the theme, even though the theme of working from a bag felt right for the mechanics and the theme matching, it just didn't work. And that was when I had to go, mechanics have to take precedent here. And I switched over to cards at that point. And then all of a sudden everything just kind of fell into place at that point. And that's one of those great moments as that designer, when the one little tiny thing you switched over, everything clicks.
And it's often like, I've sort of been looking at a lot of designer sort of discussions, and they basically say often the thing you love most is the thing that's wrecking your game.
Yeah, it's the whole kill your darlings thing from screenwriting, right? Like, you have to go back and go, what's this one thing you've been hanging on to that is your favorite thing? Oftentimes that's the thing that's holding you back. Yep, absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
One person said basically every time they've gone into a game design with this cool idea, that cool idea hasn't ended up being in the game because it's just never worked. And one of them said that they felt so happy that they got to use one of their cool ideas, but it was from like 3 games back because it didn't work in that one.
Yes.
And then finally he was like, oh my God, the solution to this problem is that thing I had to throw in the other game.
Yes.
So
I can't remember what designer told me this, and this was before I had started Coyote and Crow, but I was having a conversation with a game designer about that, and he said something very similar, where he said, I had this thing, and I just had to shelve the mechanic. The mechanic itself just went on a shelf and went away, and it came back like 10 years later, and I was like, oh, light bulb moment, pull that thing out of the closet, it's perfect for this thing. So yeah, there's already a mental shelf for me of mechanics that I'm sort of kind of sitting on right now. So
ages ago, I tried to make a board game based on, I had an idea for what I thought was a really great mechanic, and I still think it's a really great mechanic if I can ever figure out how to make it work. But it just did not work in the game I was trying to do it with.
Yeah.
It was this sort of rolling auction where each turn it takes a turn action to make a bid. And the problem is that way, the longer something takes to buy, the more you're using up that opportunity cost.
Yeah.
The problem is that you also need a way for the game to progress, because if you're getting stuck on this auction thing and it's taking a turn each time, it's like, how do I fix it? And I still haven't figured out how to fix it. But if I do, and the other thing about talking about mechanics like this is if somebody else steals it and fixes it,
yeah, absolutely.
I will play that game.
Yep.
So
you'll have an aha moment. There'll be a moment in the shower or something when you'll think of it. It'll just come right to you.
I find those moments typically come when I'm trying to sleep,
Oh
and then they
yeah.
just blow up my ability to sleep until I get up and do something, and it's
Yes.
part of the reason why I don't get sleep.
Yes, for sure.
So I saw that you've got the current stretch goal is about to be hit, and I see
Yes.
you've got some other ones for, and these look like charitable stretch goals, which I also kind of wanted to talk about
Yeah.
here because
I
one
think we
thing
had. Oh, go ahead.
one thing I liked about the previous Kickstarter was that it had some charitable aspects to it as well.
Yeah,
So
I think we had just such a good response from those donations for the first Coyote and Crow RPG. I think I just right away, as I formed the company and jumped away from my former day job and formed this company, one of the first things I thought of was is I really want to build philanthropic concepts into all of my crowdfunding campaigns. And I already feel really lucky to be in the position I am. So I just feel like I want to pay it forward. In this case, we've got pledge levels where folks can set aside a donation copy, and then any school or library can just apply for a donation copy, and we'll send it out to them. And then we're also doing our next stretch goal is actually going to be $1 per backer as a donation to Illuminative. Illuminative is a really fantastic nonprofit organization that does a whole bunch of work, both in the U.S. and Canada, on Indigenous rights, missing and murdered Indigenous women, all kinds of Indigenous-focused charity work. So if we get 2,000 backers, it'll be $2,000 to Illuminative. And then I want to start a grant fund. I don't know if we're going to hit this goal this time, but one of the things I encountered early on in the Coyote and Crow role-playing game was that a lot of folks that I was working with on the RPG had never been to a game convention. They really wanted to work in games, but they'd never been to a game convention. So I thought about this and I was like, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it is a lot to go to a game convention. It can be hotels and the ticket costs. Especially if you're traveling out of town and then you've got airfare to deal with, that's something not a lot of folks can do.
If you're going to something like Essen Spiel, it's
let alone something like Essen, which you could easily drop 10 or 15 grand without even batting an eye, right? That's way out of the reach for most people. So I'd love to be able to start a grant fund where I can send some artists or writers to game conventions and let them feel like they're a little more engaged in this community and maybe see a different side of it. A lot of the natives that I know who game are gaming at home with their family or their local friend group, and they're not really getting to see much of the larger, greater game community. And I'd love for them to experience that. I was privileged enough to work for a company that paid for me to travel to a lot of those conventions for years. And I got a much wider view of the industry because of that.
Well, and especially if you've got something like you've got a prototype, you think it's ready to go. How does that? A lot of that gets shopped around at those conventions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I was lucky enough to go to Essen at one point just because I was in Europe already.
Wow,
I did a
nice.
semester abroad, so I was like, it was actually fairly cheap for me to make that jump once I was already that close.
Yeah.
But then it was, the amount of the major publishers who were sitting there like, here is this game we're showing off, but they also had somebody there who was actually listening to pitches. And I actually saw people making pitches at the time going, and they're like, here's my elevator pitch, here's my sell sheet, here's my here's all of this. And I'm going, if you can't do that, that's a tremendous obstacle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The company that I used to work for, a lot of times we would arrange pitch sessions for indie publishers or first-time publishers to go in and pitch to places like Barnes and Noble and Target. And watching that process, watching them go from having dealt with the game industry, the hobby industry on this very small scale to somebody like Barnes and Noble, it's a fascinating process. And I hope that through the course of my being a publisher, I can open the door for a few folks and kind of show them the ropes. Because again, I feel like Indigenous representation within the game industry on the publishing side is pathetically poor. Like it's bad. And just even a few more people in this industry besides myself. I don't want to be a flag waver or a torchbearer my whole life. I just like to go design games I like, right? Like I don't mind being known for the guy who did the Indigenous RPG. That's cool, but I would rather be known as the guy who opened the door for a whole bunch of other Indigenous game designers. That's what I'd really like to be known as.
And it's really easy to do the selfish thing and be known as the Indigenous board game group.
Yeah.
And like pull up the ladder just so that you can take all of the all of that interest.
Yeah.
And so I really I'm impressed when I see people saying, hey, rather than taking up the ladder, maybe I'll try to build stairs, so that the person behind me doesn't have to climb the ladder. It's
absolutely, that is the goal.
And then once we've got stairs, let's put in a ramp. Let's
yes, exactly.
So yeah, no, I really appreciated that, seeing that, because it's tough.
It is
a lot of when I think of like Dungeons and Dragons, which I've been playing since I was like I don't know, 10.
Yeah, same here, yeah.
It's had a lot of like Indigenous themed stories written by people who have never even like visited a reserve, let alone Indigenous people themselves.
Yeah.
So I would like to see more of those stories being written by people who have some background. Looking at Coyote and Crow, like I really liked looking at some of the like the monster design and like the creature design, because I'm going, these are from stories. You can feel that. And they're this whole cool new world.
Yeah, I think, and that was a lot of fun because specifically for that section, I wrote a good number of those in there, but I also spoke with my writers and I said, look, to some degree, it was a save it for the sequels. Like there were some we decided, like with Deer Woman. Deer Woman has a lot of different iterations across a number of different nations and tribes, and so we included Deer Woman in the book because we felt like, hey, this is one a lot of folks know, even if they're not Indigenous. A lot of folks are familiar with Deer Woman, so we put that in there. But then there were other ones where I said, let's create something whole cloth, but in the spirit of your stories. Like let's take some stories but then let's create something entirely new that would only exist in the world of Coyote and Crow. And then there were other ones like, well, I won't name drop because they're going to be coming in future books, but there were some that were also very specific to specific nations or tribes. And we were like, well, hey, we want to include these, but let's wait until we have the source book for those regions coming out, and then we can highlight them more. We can give them more than just a page or two. We can actually, dive into more context and more detail on these things because they deserve more than a page. So,
yeah, that can be tough because for some of this stuff, it's building on a body of knowledge that your average D&D player already sort of has, but in a lot of ways, because Indigenous culture hasn't permeated in any way through that community, if there's only one page, it might be fine for something like a basilisk that people have this sort of background for. But if it's a new thing to you, then it's not enough, I guess, is my thoughts on that. So yeah, this is this is for me a real treat, because when I saw the Coyote and Crow Kickstarter, I jumped on that, and
thank you.
Well, I was like, this is something new. It's exciting, and looking through it, it was clear that you've got sort of higher principles than just, hey, this is going to make me some money, which is, it's always nice to support people who've got some some principles on that. But and I really liked. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's really funny because we started as the original goal was, I think, 18 grand, and we were expecting it to be, I think it still says on my Kickstarter page, a 300-page book, and we ended up at 471 because once the Kickstarter started to take off, we had so many of the writers. I had so many writers throwing ideas at me and going, guys, we're going to have to dial this back a little bit. Like the book's got to have a certain page count. We got to cut it off at, right? And so
it can't be an encyclopedia.
Yeah, exactly. At a certain point, gamers will rebel if the book is too big. And I already think I was pushing the boundaries on that at 471 pages. I think it's 471. But yeah, so we kind of had to curb some of that, but it felt really good to know that I had that much support and backing for this to be able to add in a few more creatures or add a few more pages of context. And we tried to, I hope that there's no fluff in there. Unlike Dungeons and Dragons, we don't have like a DM's guide and a player's guide and a monster manual. It's all three in one, right? So you have a lot of material in there. And hopefully it's all useful at some point to everybody. Hopefully we didn't just pad those pages.
Yeah, no, it looks like a pretty solid book. And it's funny, earlier I was going, I've got to get this off my, off the shelf. Now my shelves are too small to take a book standing up. So it was laying down, and I actually had trouble finding it because I was looking for something that was the sort of right thickness for a role-playing game book.
Yep.
And I only spotted it when I was like, it can't be that big, thick, chunky thing. And then sure enough, that's exactly what it was. So I was like, all right, yep.
I don't know if we'll ever put out a book that big again, but it's a beast to ship for sure. But yeah, I think it's also really important for me to call out here that I had goals for the role-playing game, but once the role-playing game took off, I sort of added a goal, which is kind of where I'm at with Wolves now. And that goal was, I thought it was important to address the fact that there can be a real cost hurdle to getting into role-playing games. And that because to some degree, I'm trying to reach new native audiences. There's lots of Indigenous nerds out there that are already, playing role-playing games, but I wanted to reach some native folks that weren't aware of modern gaming. That I introduced board games into this equation because they're much easier to get to the table than a role-playing game. There's a lot less terrifying for folks who have never played a role-playing game. You can play them in a single sitting and be done with it, and it's not an extended campaign situation. And the cost is generally a lot lower. So it was important for me to add board games to the sort of publisher framework that I was going with, because I want to draw folks in. And as much as I love role-playing games, there can be a lot of obstacles there.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, if you've never played a role-playing game, it might be a big, it's a big mental sort of jump. And I'm thinking some of the reserves in Canada, because of various sort of factors, they range from fairly well off to incredibly impoverished.
Yeah.
And so the ability to have, even things like the ability to just buy a set of dice for everyone at the table kind of thing can be a big deal. So a board game at the library might be just the thing.
Yeah. I mean, and that was another reason for, our donation options. It was another reason that that we created a dice app for folks that aren't near a game store or don't have easy access to Amazon delivery and don't just have a set of 12-sided dice lying around. We created a free mobile app that'll download that has a dice roller on it. And that way you can just simulate all your dice on your phone. I think there's a lot of ways to, increase accessibility for RPGs. It just takes a little creativity and a little thought.
Yeah. I also wanted to give a shout out to Pimetaway Games, who I understand is your Canadian distributor. And I saw on Twitter that they were handling sort of the getting those copies of Coyote and Crow out to, the various places they need to be. So
they're amazing. So David there has become a good friend, and we're going to be working even more. We're working even more closely in the coming months. But they're going to handle our Canadian fulfillment for the Kickstarter for Wolves. They're handling my web stores Canadian fulfillment. Originally, we were not doing our web store to Canadian customers. The shipping was just outrageously expensive.
It's like this wall of money at the border.
Yes. So I just basically shipped David a ton of my inventory, and he's holding on to it for me. And then that way he has plenty for his store, but then he can also fulfill my web stores. And then situations like with the Peace Library system,
I want to call out, there's a book distributor in Canada called Library Bound, and they handle distribution to a lot of libraries. They have very generously taken in a bunch of my copies and are giving it out to any library or school that asks for a single copy. But what happened was Peace Library System came in and said, yeah, I'd like 90 copies. And so Library Bound came back to me and said, this group wants 90 copies. We told them we could give them one, but should we have them talk to you? So we just had a conversation with them and David at Palmetto Way, and I said, David, just send them, give them what they need. And they actually drove down from their offices at the Peace Library System down to Palmetto Way Games and picked up the inventory so we could avoid shipping altogether. And that was really great. That was a great moment for me. I loved that.
Well, that's fantastic. They're actually just local here. They're a board game store that I've got a copy of Call of Cthulhu right over there that I picked up over there. So no, they're a good store. And if you're in Edmonton and you want to, they carry some of the stuff that might be hard to find elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Which even over some of the places that have bigger stock. Like I also go to Mission Fun and Games, which has a bigger store, but there's certain things that I'm just much more likely to find at Palmetto Way than I'd find there.
Yeah.
So it's
well, it's always tough, I think, for stores too. I'm a big fan of local game stores, and having worked in one, I know how difficult it can be when you've got 1,000 titles to choose from, but only space on your shelf for 500. It becomes a real puzzle of what to put on your shelf and what your customers want, and trying to encourage them toward good games. That's a tough position to be in. So,
well, and I imagine that their margins are typically, razor thin a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, the store we worked at, it was the majority of the profit came in from food and beer sales, certainly not game sales. I mean, it's okay, it's not bad, but if it had just been a game store, I'm not sure we would have been able to stay open. I think it was the food and the Magic the Gathering and the beer that put us over the top.
Yeah, it's a tough, any business that people get into because they love it is a tough business to be in, because you're competing with people who might be willing to live a slightly, live with less in order to be in that business. It's
yes. And you find that a lot within hobby publishing too, hobby game publishing. I know a number of publishers who are like, hey, I used to be a gamer, and then hey, I developed a game, and then hey, it turned into a thing that I do in my that takes up my entire garage, and now my entire garage is stacked up with my last Kickstarter, and I had to rent out a storage space, and I had to put out a mortgage in my home. I actually know somebody who put out a mortgage in their home to fund a game, and I feel horrible for that person if they had to do that.
Oh, I mean, I guess that's another place where Kickstarter is amazing, because you can at least have the funding in hand before you start the thing. Because I know before Kickstarter and so forth, a lot of board game stuff, it was like, we're making our best guess as to how many of these will sell.
Yeah.
And it might be that it sells out immediately, and that's a problem. Because when can you print another one, and will it still have hype when it or it doesn't sell at all? And then you've got all of these copies that there were a lot of game designers who ended up with like a garage full of games, and they were good games sometimes, like really good games.
I could tell you horror stories about the distributor that I worked for, where we would have a publisher call us and go, I'm going to have you throw away all 5,000 of those games because I need them as a tax write-off this year. They're not going to sell, and I need to be able to write them off. And we would have to go out and not me personally, but folks in the warehouse would have to go out and throw out 5,000 board games. And that hurt. That was painful. Even if I didn't like the game, it was terrible.
Yeah. And there's just nothing to be done. It's like you can't anything. It's just they're gone. It's some of them there are great games that have failed. And sometimes it's just the theme doesn't land with people or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's another aspect to that, and I think that we're one of the few industries, the hobby board game industry is one of the few industries that has a horrible transparency issue when it comes to inventory and supply and demand.
because so many of the distributors are opaque and unwilling to sort of share information when it comes to their customers and their demand. It's very difficult once a game has left a warehouse for a publisher to determine, if I sold 5,000 copies to 5 different distributors, how many of those are sitting in their warehouse and how many of them are on store shelves and how many of them actually have reached customers. And figuring out that supply and demand is just so difficult. I feel really bad for publishers who are overprinting or underprinting. It's crushing for them.
Oh, it can be the end of people too.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
We've got some questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's do questions.
So Joe Loy was asking, who are you aiming your game at?
Oh, that's a great question. So my games hopefully are aimed at, let me tackle my 2 big titles here, Wolves and Coyote and Crow. So Coyote and Crow is absolutely aimed at anybody who likes role-playing games. Hopefully I'm attracting natives who see themselves represented in the game. And I'm also hoping that I'm also giving a fresh take to current role-playing game fans that want to see something different than Dragons and Wizards. I think there's a lot of fun to be had in the world that we created for Coyote and Crow, and I don't think it's limited to any specific age range or specific demographic, other than wanting to play in a cool sci-fi fantasy world. When it comes to Wolves, Wolves is a very family-friendly game with some strategy. It is meant for all audiences. I think and I hope that Indigenous folks will see those concepts in there, but I don't need non-Indigenous folks to see those concepts in Wolves. As long as they understand how to play the game, that's fine. I'm not there to, it's not there to be an educational game. So as long as people are engaged in it and having a good time, that's all I really care about. It's probably, 10 and up for Wolves, I would say, maybe 12 and up. It's especially listed as 15 and up on the box because we didn't test it for safety testing for small pieces. But yeah, I think it's a really family-friendly game, and there's nothing in the game Wolves that is even kind of aimed at specifically at Indigenous people.
Yeah, I suppose at least you have to be old enough to not eat the pieces.
Yeah, old enough to not eat the pieces is a good start.
Yeah, it's no, I mean, board games are fantastic because a lot of them can be played by a variety of ages.
Oh yeah, I think I started playing chess when I was like 5 or 6. That was my first game.
Somebody mentioned that they work at a rest home, and somebody moved into the rest home and donated to the library their board game set. So the library actually had to put in extra shelves, and they were just figuring okay, we'll have these and then we'll throw them out later because no one's playing them, because they had copies of Monopoly that no one was playing. And suddenly there was a bunch, everybody was sitting down and playing Settlers of Catan and Power Grid and so forth. And they were going, wait, we didn't know people actually like board games.
Yeah, when you put some good ones in there, who knows what you'll get? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, nobody wants to play Snakes and Ladders because, yeah. So we've got another one here. Saying look at modern day Peru, where there's a mix of native and modern. So is that something you've looked at?
So 2 things we've got going on in South America right now. So first of all, we're partnered with a localizer in Brazil, a RPG publisher in Brazil, who's going to be doing a localized version of Coyote and Crow in Portuguese. While we sell Coyote and Crow in English technically to South America through my current distributor, they're going to have much better penetration just because they have a local following. So I think getting it there in Portuguese is going to help a lot. We're also partnered. I can't say who yet because we're officially announcing in just a couple of weeks, but we're partnering with somebody else, another company, another game company that is going to be hopefully spearheading our expansion books for Coyote and Crow that are both Mesoamerica and South America, and they've got a bunch of writers. I don't have a lot of contacts in those parts of the world, and I wanted to make sure when we do those expansions that the writers for those expansions had some authentic voices. So this partner company is going to be able to give us a lot more authentic voices in that department. And I'm looking forward to that. It's probably going to take a little while to get there, but we will.
Now I'm curious if there's any projects to translate this into some of the indigenous languages like Cree and so forth.
Yeah, so that was actually,
although that might be a monumental task.
Yeah, one of my first goals actually was to get this into Cherokee. The problem is that most indigenous languages already have so few speakers, and it's already such a massive undertaking to translate anything, that translating a 471-page RPG book is not big. However, I have a standing rule that says if anybody translates Coyote and Crow into any indigenous language, I will do the layouts for a PDF version, and it will always be free. I will put any native language PDF version of Coyote and Crow on my website for free in perpetuity. I don't want to ever charge money for that. So
that one thing that is kind of promising is that here in Canada, there's projects that have been fairly successful at providing some revival for some indigenous languages.
Yeah.
There's Cree classes. Yeah. So I know some languages are at risk of, dying out, unfortunately, but
yeah,
which is tragic.
COVID hit us hard down here in the States when it came to languages. We lost a lot of elders who were really fluent during COVID. So we're still recovering from that down here. Yeah,
and that's tragic because every elder is a library basically, and it's so
it hurts.
Yeah, and I'm seeing how would you sell your brand or game to a family?
Ooh, all right. I feel like I'm on a competition show all of a sudden with this question. Our games represent both indigenous values and modern board gaming concepts. We encourage social play, cooperative play, and mechanisms that inspire and represent Native people in a positive and accurate light. That's about as succinctly as I could put it.
I think a good push would be to try to get this into schools. To get, including for non-Indigenous schools, to just be everybody who just sees like old Westerns and that's their notion of Indigenous people. It's like, or, stereotypes that are negative, there's a lot of people, you ask them about Indigenous people, they come up with some, negative stereotype, or at best something like casinos. It's like, there's more to it, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So
I really, really encourage anybody who lives within reasonable range of a powwow to go to a powwow. And I know there's a lot of non-natives out there that think they're not going to be welcome. You'll know if you're not welcome. If it's the kind of thing that it's intra-tribal, they'll say, hey, you should have to show your tribal ID or whatever. But most of them are very welcoming of the public. And if you go in there with an open heart and an open mind, I think you're going to see a lot of things. If you've never been to a powwow, I think you're going to see a lot of things that are going to blow your mind and give you some new perspective. Not to mention great food.
I can say I was doing fireworks at a Treaty Days out here, and not only was everybody super like I'm just there to set up fireworks, but they were super welcoming. They were like, come on out. And some of the people I was with were a little cowardly, I'm going to say, and sort of stereotype bound. So they didn't want to leave the fireworks area. And I'm like, what is the problem? You're at a festival, like everybody's here in a good mood. And I had a great time wandering around, seeing what people were doing. And they were saying, come eat. And, it was great food. Like they were, so I absolutely, encourage people, because it's, you'll find that the culture is a lot more welcoming and a lot more rich than you might have expected. So
yeah, absolutely.
And Traveling Science Man was also asking, what is the best way to get in touch with you?
There's a contact form on our website, coyoteandcrow.net. That just goes directly to me. Like I said, I'm the only one in the company, so I read all of those emails. Generally, I get back to folks within 24 to 48 hours. I'm pretty quick about it.
Yeah, that's what I was how I got in touch, and also I think he was asking because Traveling Science Man is in Peru at the moment.
Oh wow!
So
Okay.
I think that's why he's got that sort of interest on that.
Sure.
He was mentioning possible translation or something along those lines. So he says, "What has been your favorite part in the creative process for this, and what's been the biggest hurdle and headache?"
All right. So my favorite creative part of this process was once I had established the sort of bones of the Coyote and Crow universe, the alternate timeline, the sort of basics of the RPG mechanics side of things, and I had all that structured out. And I was at that point where I knew I wanted to bring in new writers, and I sort of handed over that material to them, seeing what their imaginations added on to that. It was kind of like giving people all of the ingredients for a cake and then go make a cake and seeing what they came back with. It was not only humbling, but incredibly rewarding, seeing how their different perspectives, their cultural backgrounds, how they came up with these completely different configurations for cultural events or creatures or spirits, all these different things they came up with. It was literally tear-inducing, just seeing that sort of indigenous imagination being sparked, far more than I would have ever imagined it would. And then I think the biggest hurdle, I touched on this briefly, was that finding artists. So my original goal had been to have nothing but native writers and artists on this. But where you've got a Venn diagram of artists, and you've got artists who are passionate about their work but have never done anything professional, and then professional artists who are native but make their living doing it, there is very little space between those two. Where, like, for example, one of our artists is Jeffrey Varega. He did a piece. He's worked for Marvel Comics. When I spoke to him, he was very excited about working on Coyote and Crow, but he also said, it's probably going to take me about 12 to 18 months to get you 2 pieces because I'm so busy. And that was longer than my entire timeline for the Kickstarter. And then
also, here's my price sheet, and you're like, oh.
yeah. And we ended up having 1 piece in there, and it's an amazing piece, and I love it. And on the other hand, folks who had never worked on a professional RPG publication before, and I would have to spend 2 or 3 times as much time as an art director working with them on, like, this is why you can't hand in a 72 DPI JPEG for publication. I need you to go back and do this at 300 DPI. And like having those kinds of conversations with somebody new is really time consuming. And then they get frustrated, and sometimes they quit and flake on you and disappear. And that's, maybe they weren't built for the RPG industry, and that's okay. That's all right. But it's those kind of hurdles that took, I started writing Coyote and Crow in 2018, and we weren't able to go to Kickstarter until 2021. And it took me that long to just get probably 30% of the art.
I can tell you that's not unique to the Indigenous artist sphere. Yeah. I've had projects where it's like, okay, I need some artists, and it's just, oh man, sometimes they can be tough to wrangle.
Yeah. On the plus side, the thing that's come out of that is that I now have about 4 or 5 artists, native artists, that I love working with, and they're people that I keep going back to, and we've established a really good relationship. People that I love their art, I love who they are, and we work well together. So,
and that's a fantastic resource to have built.
Yeah.
Is just that list of contacts and list of connections. Because
I just wish it was bigger than more than 4 or 5.
If I ever get my board game idea off the ground, like right now, it's just using temporary Mid-Journey art, like because it's just like you need it to be on a table fast.
Yep.
And I wasn't going to hire a professional artist for something that I may end up throwing out every component for.
I don't think anybody's nobody's going to judge prototypes, right? Like, prototypes are prototypes. You do what you have to. So.
Oh, I mean, I did get some flack from somebody who's like, why are you using Mid-Journey for your prototype? I'm like, I'm not putting an artist out of work here. Like, the alternative is it's going to be on index cards with Sharpie written on it. There was no world in which this was going to be an artist. But I'm already wincing at, like, when I go to hire an artist, because I've had bad experiences in the past. Like,
Yeah.
all right, here's here's the deadlines we need. You've agreed to those. Here's all of this, and then they just vanish. Rather than deliver or something like that. It's like, all right.
I definitely have like a naughty list and a nice list, and there's a few folks on the naughty list that I will never deal with again.
The experience of like you've agreed to the timeline, they're past the timeline. You're like, hey, can I get an update? They're like, I need another 3 weeks. You're like, cool, I can work with that. 3 weeks comes by. They're like, hey, I need another 3 weeks. You're like, getting a little annoyed, but okay. And then 3 weeks later, they stop responding entirely. It's like, yeah.
It can be disheartening for sure. It can be very disheartening.
So is that your biggest hurdle or headache on that? Or is it something else?
That's probably the biggest one. It's the one that gave me the most. It gave me the most like soul trouble, because as the game was being developed, I kept going, when do I stop trying to work with person X and go with non-native person Y, who I know can get the job done? And there was this sort of trade-off that I kept having to do with going, I need to get the book done, but I want to work with as many Indigenous people as possible. And that finding that balance in a way that I could sleep at night was really tough. Everything else, dealing with printers and publishers and shipping agents and all that stuff, it's the usual headache, right? It's the expected stuff in publishing.
Yeah, and I suppose it's especially tough because there's a whole political aspect to getting non-Indigenous artists drawing in an Indigenous style.
Yeah.
That's politically fraught. And I think it's probably less so in your case, but because it's an Indigenous project and so forth, but it's still landmines to navigate.
Absolutely. The more attention the game got, the more I was worried about, the sort of train of social media that can get going, that sort of locomotive of anger about a way something is being represented in the real world, in a game. And there's been a lot of games that have gotten a lot of, due flack. They were due the flack that they got. But I tried really hard, and I tried really to be transparent whenever and as often as I could in my process. And I think that paid off. I think going, hey, I couldn't do this, I wanted to do this, or I got this person on board, but I couldn't get this person. I think that transparency helped.
I mean, I wouldn't want to do, I'm not going to put out something in the same theme as Wolves, but it does strike me that it's an additional cost, because like if I make a game that is themed around, Bunny Kingdom, for instance, it's an innocuous theme, but it doesn't move the needle in terms of helping anything, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But nobody's ever going to get upset at Bunny Kingdom. They don't have to worry about whether or not they've stepped into something political. Whereas that's a cost you pay that no one else, that others don't.
Yes, absolutely. Although I will say there's probably somebody out there that really is angry at Bunny Kingdom. There's somebody, right? But
but they're probably not getting traction. And I mean, there are game concepts that maybe you shouldn't do now. Like, you wouldn't want to make the original Puerto Rico now.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely
not. And there's various other games that have been made that where you're just like, in hindsight, this is some super cringy theming.
Oh yeah. I mean, and I'm not going to name drop here, but there is absolutely a game that was recently came out and was recently published by a large board game publisher that has an Indigenous concept to it. And when I questioned who their consultants were, they said, our Italian designer is a big fan of Native American history. And that was it. Ooh. That was their only answer. And I am still angry about that game to this day, and angry at that publisher. And I will have that conversation with them to their face.
Yeah, no, that's I guess we don't need to. I try to avoid being, notwithstanding the fact that I've been now calling out the orc license, which is its whole other thing, but I try not to be a drama channel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would rather, going back to my whole ethos, right? Like, I would rather present a positive portrayal and a positive alternative rather than dwell on the negative.
Yeah, and in some ways, if you're doing the dwelling on it, you can actually make it too toxic of a field for anybody to be in.
Absolutely.
Because if the last 3 people who published an Indigenous theme, even if they were offensive at it, created a social media firestorm, then a genuine Indigenous person approaching it in a reasonable way who takes it to a big publisher, that publisher is going to look at it and go, no, too spicy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to the whole thing about me holding the door open, right? Like, I don't want to publish. A, I don't want to publish every Indigenous game out there, and B, I don't want all of my games to be about indigeneity. I want to publish stuff that's just random sci-fi stuff too, right? You know, there was a comment that I made at some point on a panel where I said, if a native person made a game about space cats fighting space dogs, is that an Indigenous game? And my answer was yes, because it's an Indigenous person who created it. And that's just their expression of their indigeneity. And maybe there's very little of it in there, but to me, that counts. And so I think what I hope for is that my games are just successful enough that maybe a publisher will accept an Indigenous game pitch to them from a person going, hey, I think Coyote and Crow's done well enough, and I see the attributes of your game here. I'll go ahead and take a chance on it.
Yeah, and that's fantastic, because always celebrate the people who are building bridges rather than the people who are, you know, tearing things down, because it's really easy to blow things up, and often it doesn't necessarily achieve what people want it to.
Absolutely.
And I see, what's your favorite board game or one you recommend the most, other than your own, of course?
You know, first of all, I love my own games, but I don't think they would actually make my list. I've got some games that I continually go back to. First of all, Android Netrunner. If I'm feeling really competitive and I want a 2-player card game, that game is endlessly fascinating to me and has done some of the best world building I've ever seen. More recently, stuff like Flamecraft, that just actually, I think, won the Origins Game Fair Award for Best Game of the Year. It's just a really fun, light game. My favorite, though, of the last year, my favorite just standard tabletop game has been the Direwolf iteration of Dune. The worker placement deck building combo for that is, to me, just chef's kiss. It's everything I want in a game. It's competitive, it's thoughtful, it's crunchy, and it makes me want to play again right after I'm done, even if I've lost. Like, it's one of those games like, oh yes, let's go again.
Now I'm gonna have to pick that one up, because it's actually what is it? I've got my prototype there, but one of the pieces of advice I got is that the instant you got a prototype done, start designing the next one. So the next idea I'm playing with is a worker placement inverse deck builder, a many versus one setup.
Okay.
Where a group of people each are doing worker placement, and the other person has cards they might want to add to their deck, and they're setting them down as costs, such that if you want to pick this action, then they get that card to add to their deck. And so you may have to choose, like, do I want to do this non-optimal thing to avoid them getting the better card? Because then you're going to have to deal with that. It's sort of a 2-phase game, I envision. Like, first a build phase where you're sort of building up your engine, and then you take that engine and actually try to sort of run it against the deck that you've set up for yourselves.
Yeah.
And so if that's
sort of opportunity costs, don't you?
I do like opportunity costs, and I think that they're critical to these things. Like, Puerto Rico is a good example of, like, I could do this, which benefits me, but it also sets up the next guy to benefit even more. And so if you want to be good at it, you also have to look at, like, what is everyone else doing? Any sort of those worker placement or action choice games are very much
I'm a big fan of action selection stuff. Anything where, you know, you get to choose the action and everyone else is taking that same action, and you get some sort of benefit because you chose it, but everybody else gets to do it too. I love that mechanic. It
Oh, it's
inevitably leads to really interesting choices.
yeah, especially it leads to that setup where you don't ever have choices where it's like, or you rarely have choices that are just obviously the choice.
Yeah.
And it's so everything's got a benefit and a drawback that is that's kind of a tough.
It's tough to balance those, right? It's tough to, I think, like at least in my experience in trying to design those, it's always been a case where one action seems like it's maybe outpowered or gets chosen more often than the others. Like, how do you balance them accurately? It can be tough.
Yeah, and I mean it's the way I always sort of describe it to people who are unfamiliar with games. Like, imagine Snakes and Ladders. If you didn't roll the dice and you just chose, how much of a game is left? And
Right,
like,
right.
so at that point, the answer is none. There is no game
None.
left.
Yeah, it's a simulation at that point.
Yeah, and so that that I love when you've got that thing of you're sitting there going, I've got 2 actions or 3 actions, and which one is good and which one is so that I find that that sort of action choice or worker placement or that kind of thing, all of those can really get to there.
Absolutely.
So that I love that kind of thing. Even stuff like Power Grid, where you're talking about like auctioning for materials and so forth. It's like,
yeah. Power Grid has some great choices in it, and I wish that game played a little more succinctly. Like it needs. I wish they'd come out with like a new edition that had some sort of streamlining to it, because that game, it always felt like it got too big.
I always felt like Power Grid needed to end like a few turns before it does.
There you go. Yeah.
So I guess maybe you could try like a board with fewer spots on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the fix is there. I'm not sure if there's an easy one, but yeah.
That's the problem. Is I suspect they've tried all of this and that they've come to this is the best we can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the difference between playing Risk and playing Shogun is huge just because of the additional elements.
Yep.
It's like both are games about conquering a board, but one of them is just you pile up your dudes and then you throw them at the other, and the other one is you have to manage your food, you have to manage your temples and all of these things, and there's so all of those mean it that you're in this position of I have choices, but they're not obvious. Risk usually is obvious choices. I've got all my people here, it attacks this place, and then we roll dice.
The bidding for the assassin on Shogun was always my favorite part. That mechanic was always the most fun. It felt like it's such a social mechanic, right? Like it can throw such a wrench into the works for any player, and it's such a gamble. But I love that stuff.
Oh, well, I could talk about board games we love all year, but we got one more question here.
Sure.
And have you ever considered making a game set in Indigenous history and lore prior to Europeans showing up, or is that knowledge not shared freely?
So that's a great question, and we could probably do a whole show on that. I would want to do it if it was me. I would want to do that if I was going to do it. I would want to do it on Cherokee history, and part of the problem with that is that the further back you go in Cherokee history, you get to a point where so much of it is oral tradition, and so little of it is written, that the further back you go, the more likely you are to encounter people who are going to argue with what you're saying or doing. They're complete opposite graphs, right? And so that gray area is, in some ways, is a space that a lot of Indigenous people like to occupy, because we don't necessarily want our storytelling and our traditions to be a matter of math. It's not a concrete thing. It's a subjective history brought forward that we pass along, right? But I think putting some of those ideas to game mechanics is an interesting challenge. I think the problem is that, again, that the further back I go, the more likely I'm going to have scholars or people who are far more educated than me than in native history arguing with me and amongst each other about the accuracy there. And I think that would be the big challenge. I do like the idea of having a game set in pre-colonial history, but I think you would almost have to like fictionalize it in sort of the same way that like Rebecca Rowanhorse does in her books. Why can't I think of the name of it? Rebecca Rowanhorse has a series, Black Crow. Why am I cannot think of the name of the series of books that she's got. But she has a book of science fiction series or science fantasy series that are sort of her answer to European mythology fantasy that are set in fictional nations with fictional religions that still capture a lot of those indigenous ideas, pre-colonial indigenous ideas, but aren't rooted in actual traditions. And I almost feel like it would have to be that. If you were going to claim any kind of historical accuracy, it just gets messy fast.
Yeah, no, and I could really see that, especially if you've got different traditions on these things.
Yeah.
So somebody's saying Black Sun might be the
Black Sun. Thank you so much, Black Sun. Yes.
the chat is usually right on those things because
yeah. And which is a great book, by the way. Highly recommend that if you want a good indigenous fantasy read. Black Sun was good stuff.
I'll have to check that one out because it's always good to read things from sort of outside of the perspective. And like Tolkien fantasy has been done and done and done and done. And there's still lots to do in that sphere. But
absolutely.
It's like I tell people, I did a video on Blades in the Dark. And I say playing Blades in the Dark may be better at every other game I play.
See that.
Because it's just a different perspective. And every time you... I don't consider a role-playing game good if I don't steal things from it to bring into other games.
Yeah.
So I've had people go, "What is this?" And playing a D&D game, I'm like, I'm stealing these rules. Like I stole factions from Stars Without Number. I stole clocks from Blades in the Dark. There's a bunch I take from Coyote and Crow now. I'm probably going to borrow a bunch of the... I really like the sort of spiritual aspect and so forth, and I think it does better than D&D typically does in terms of portraying some depth there. So I'm going to probably take some of that. So it's I think that's always a good thing. We had one more come in saying,
sure.
How do you decide when to make something more thematically Native American rather than represent the specific beliefs and values of individual tribes?
Ooh, boy. Okay. So that's a really tough question. And how I decide, I'm not sure I could verbalize that. A lot of times it boils down to personal choice for me. If I feel like something about my own cultural past speaks to whatever that storyline or mechanic is going on, like I feel like I'm driven to come up with my own answer for it. If I'm not called to it, if I don't have a specific reaction to it, oftentimes I will lob it to one of my writers or one of my artists and say, well, where do you stand on this? Does it call to you? And if they don't have an answer, then sometimes I will just make up something that has nothing to do with my indigeneity and just fits in with the game and the theme. But that is a really good question, and it's a really hard question to answer because as a reconnecting native, I didn't grow up on a reservation, and as somebody who is still in the process, I'll be in the process for the rest of my life of reconnecting with the Cherokee Nation and reconnecting with that heritage. I often can't pick out the parts of me that are just me as opposed to indigenous me. So sometimes it's tough to come up with those answers. Really good question. Sorry if that answer didn't quite get you, but best I can.
I mean, it's that's the nature of hard questions, that sometimes they sometimes they have complicated answers.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up your entire day, but I feel this has been a real treat. This is a good time. I am really impressed with everything you've been doing there, and
thank you.
Well, it was, you did a very successful Kickstarter on the first game, and then you came back and I was like, a board game?
Yeah.
Really? And then I looked at it and I was like, a board game that sounds interesting? Okay, like let's So that I thought was actually like I looked at that and I was like, I want to play this.
Yeah.
So
well, we've got another board game that is coming. It's probably not going to go to crowdfunding. I'm probably going to do this one just myself, and this one is based a little bit more on my own heritage. That's one I'm designing myself, and I'm going to be working with hopefully a Cherokee graphic designer on. But it will be definitely something that is playable by the general public. And then I'm working also on a really involved setting book for Coyote and Crow. I know setting books are usually really expansive geographically when it comes to things like Dungeons and Dragons. We talk about like world building and doing big maps and everything like that. But this setting book is actually something different. I'm actually going to be setting it on a single small town. And I really want to focus on the people that live in this world and what makes this small town unique and what makes it different. And the saga that you could have in here, the multiple adventures that you can have in here. Literally everybody in town is going to have some sort of secret or connection or story prompt to them. And hopefully it connects to the same folks that felt drawn into Coyote and Crow in the first place. So
that actually sounds really, I like the idea of, instead of going big, putting a magnifying lens on a small place to make it big.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I really love that. So guys, if you go on Kickstarter and look up Wolves, you will find it. It is currently all over their trending and exciting and all of those things lists. So it's not going to be hard to find.
Yeah.
But if you want to get a copy of that first before anyone else, that is the place to do it. You can also back two, basically, so that one goes to a a charity group, a nonprofit organization. And yeah, and otherwise, if you missed that, I'm sure they'll be out at Palmetto Way Games.
Yeah, absolutely. They will have it for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much once again for joining me, and I will hit the end broadcast button. And so
thanks for joining us, everyone. Appreciate it.